this been changed over to our, the other PowerPoint, so we're ready for her presentation? It looks like it has. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney. We're pleased to have you here. We're broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. with an on-site audience. Before we begin, I have a few tips I'd like to share with you. For those of you who have joined us here on site, I hope that you have picked up our handouts. For those of you joining us online on YouTube, those same handouts can be made available on this YouTube page. You'll find it as a captioning, as a link. You'll also find a link to our captioning. I ask if you have any questions on YouTube, please use the chat feature. For those of you here on site, I have a request. If you could please hold your questions until the end. So let's begin our presentation today. We are pleased to have Netisha Currie, her presentation on Protecting America's Treasures, Black History in the Vault. Ms. Currie is an archive specialist in the Textual Processing Division at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I'm not going to read her whole biography. As you can see, she's well-versed, and we'll go ahead and get started. This is her first slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter today, Netisha Currie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, let's start. So this presentation is all about records that are in the so-called vault. I work in the vault at A2. There's also other vaults all across the country. Whenever I say I work in the vault, people's eyes kind of get really wide and like, ooh, what's that? Unfortunately, it does not have an entrance like this, and sometimes people are disappointed by the regular stack door that we have. So the National Archives vaults are storage areas with restricted access to a limited amount of employees. The vaults all over the country and many other NARA facilities, including presidential libraries, records stored in the vaults are considered specially protected and of high intrinsic value. In order to provide access to the vault to researchers, we usually provide copies or digital images to our researchers. We also regularly display many of our vault items in exhibits and loan them out to other museums and institutions. The purpose of the vaults is to protect the records. Like I said, they are very highly valuable. I work in the textual vault. There's also a still pictures vault, a motion pictures vault, and special media vault. So all of the records I deal with are artifacts or textual records. And they include ceremonial letters, public laws, photographs, surrender documents, presidential gifts. There's patents and also treaties. So things that I usually say it wouldn't be in the best interest to let researchers continually pull and touch over and over again. We keep in our vaults for their safety and to preserve it for a longer time. So my presentation will go over documents kind of in a chronological way, and on these in-between slides I have some other records that are also in the vault. One is the Emancipation Proclamation, facsimile that was made for the Sanitary Commission, and the other document on the left is George Washington genealogical chart that was made in the 1800s. So the first record I'll go over is the Book of Negroes, also the inspection roll for Negroes. This has recently became pretty prominent in the U.S. BET just showed a 6-part series during the Black History Month. This record was made in 1783. It actually comprised of 2 ledgers that listed names, ages, descriptive info of about 3,000 enslaved African Americans, indentured servants, and freedmen that were going to be evacuated from the United States at the conclusion of the American Revolution. And they were leaving because they had decided to ally themselves with the British forces. One great incentive that many African Americans decided to go to the British side was they provided the incentive that they would provide freedom from slavery. So a lot of people decided to fight for the British side. The volumes have been completely digitized in Fold 3, and it is partially available in the National Archives catalog with the NAID, which is the National Archives Identifier. So the ledgers were enclosed originally in a report that was sent to George Washington in 1784, and they were intended to function as an inventory that would kind of keep track of property that was seized by the British forces during the war. One of the statutes of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War was that all property that had been seized by the British was supposed to be given back to the Americans. So in lieu of that, given that the British had already made this incentive that if you'll come fight for us, we will give you freedom or manumit you, one of the British commander, Guy Carleton, decided not to honor that piece of the treaty and instead compromised with George Washington and said, hey, we'll write this list down so that your American forces and former slave owners and everything could have a list of all the property that you lost, and later on we'll send you a check to make up for this loss of property. Happily, there's never been a record of that check that was sent to the U.S. government afterwards. So these are some close-ups on the actual pages of the Book of Negroes. The column headings, going from left to right, are vessels, names, and commanders, which was the ship that the people would be leaving from New York on, where bound, which was usually a port somewhere in Nova Scotia, which was a British colony at the time. Negroes' names, age, and description, which was a physical description saying stout fellow or something like that, and claimants' names and places of residence. This column was for if any of the formerly enslaved African Americans or indentured servants or freedmen, if there was a slave owner in the States that had a claim on them and were like, they shouldn't be released because they didn't fight for the British and I still have a claim of them as property, their name would be listed here. And a lot of times, in lots of the pages, this column is rarely filled out. Next is the names of person whose possession they now are, which was the name of the British soldier who would vouch for the African Americans to be able to board the ship. And then there's a remarks section. And the remarks section is kind of the nice narrative meat of the document. There's lots of details such as the person's place of birth or origin, their status as being a freed person or a slave, and how long they fought for the British. So the first lines of this particular section says, William Scott, who's 21, described as a stout fellow. He's vouched for by David Wright. And under his remarks that he was born in Charles City, Virginia, he worked for Betty Harden until he was 21. Other remarks are formed like formerly the property of David Cooper in Virginia left him 3 years ago. So there's this really well-documented timeline established of the point at which somebody either escaped to freedom or sought up lines with the British. So this is a really valuable kind of genealogical record. Like I said before, many of the ships that were leaving New York would eventually end up in Nova Scotia, and they were settled in a little kind of town in Nova Scotia. Most of the African Americans, or now Canadian Americans, African Canadians, decided to continue on and go back to the African continent, and the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone was established. So the last kind of part of the Book of Negroes is the Commissioner's Note, which is at the end of every section of the ship's list. And it's just a note that certifies that the commissioners, who were U.S. American fighters, had inspected the ships and had certified the count of the people that were on the ship, and it was kind of the okay that was given that allowed the British to violate this part of the Treaty of Paris that said, we can leave with your property, kind of thing. This specific note certifies that on board the ship were 44 men, 29 women, 32 children, and it states that a penalty, if there are any like stowaways on the ship or anything, that the master of the vessel would be severely punished. Don't know what that meant. So that's the Book of Negroes. There's a blog about it as well in the handout too. Next is a letter from George Washington to Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson was the Secretary of the Continental Congress, and this letter is kind of neat because it actually refers to the Book of Negroes. George Washington says he had received a report from the embarkations and evacuation of New York, who had made a report of their proceedings to me, accompanied by a voluminous list of the slaves which had left that place. So this is citing the actual 2 ledgers that we have in our holdings now. And in the rest of the letter, it's kind of a meta-archives thing, where he goes through the whole chain of custody of where these ledgers are now, basically because someone handed him the books of Negroes, and then they were like, oh, you can keep this is your copy, Congress has another copy. And then someone came back and said, oh, wait, George, Congress actually doesn't have a copy, so they kind of need your copy for the congressional record. So George goes on to explain in this letter, he's like, well, I have my copy, but it's kind of a big volume to send in the mail. So let me know what you would like to do. It's kind of a running email list chain that we have now in our offices of where's this signed document and stuff. So it's kind of funny to look at the language of 1785. And he also has a line, the last line of the letter is, the originals shall be sent, although it will make a chasm in my files and disappoint many who apply to them for information respecting their Negroes. So this is that claimants column again in the Book of Negroes. Full disclosure, it's well known, George Washington was a slave owner, had many slaves on his plantation in Mount Vernon. And inside the inspection roll, there are actually 3 people listed as coming from Mount Vernon who had escaped George Washington's plantation. They had all left during various points in the Revolutionary War, but Daniel Payne, who was 22, Deborah Squash, who was 20, and Henry Washington, who was 43, had all left George Washington's Mount Vernon at that time. So he had some interest in kind of keeping this ledger to himself so that his friends, other plantation owners, could refer to the list and see if they had lost any, again, property. Next, this is a record that is kept in the Archives 1 vault, as was the Book of Negroes. The cover sheet and judgment of Justice Taney in the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court decision, which came from 1857. Story of Dred Scott, if no one knows, he was born a slave in Virginia in 1795 and traveled around with his owner, who was posted as an army doctor, or not as an army, but he traveled to Missouri, where he was sold to an army doctor. who traveled also around to Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin, which were all free states. One time when his owner was posted to another military base as a surgeon, he decided to rent Dred Scott's services out to someone else, and he would collect the wages that Dred Scott was earning for his work as profit for the owner. So this was a major violation of the Missouri Compromise because he was in effect bringing slavery into a free territory, which was not supposed to have any at all. So after about 10 years of going through this process of continually being hired out to others and not collecting any of his own wages, because it was supposed to be freedmen's labor, Dred Scott tried to purchase his freedom for himself and his family, but was refused and then decided to sue. The decision took another 10 or 15 years to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in one of the first major landmark cases on this question of slavery and everything, the justices ruled that descendants of Africans who were slave or free were not considered citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue. So it just basically threw out his whole case. And it also declared that the Missouri Compromise was void, so it eventually erased the dividing line of slave and free states, North and South, and you could basically be anywhere now. 3 months after this Supreme Court ruling, which effectively put Dred Scott back in the place of slavery, as well as his family, the Scott family was freed. Their former owners had gone back to their former owners, and they decided to free them. But Dred Scott unfortunately died a year and a half later of tuberculosis. Next, these are some snippets from a scrapbook of Confederate currency that was collected by the Bureau of Accounts in the Treasury Department. At the National Archives, we collect records, 1% to 3% permanent records of the federal government. And during the Civil War, there was the Confederate government, which is not part of this federal government. But after the war, the government decided to confiscate a lot of Confederate states' records of their government because that's a good idea. And so this is kind of just demonstrating the presence of African Americans even in the Confederate South records. In their bills, there are often these illustrations of enslaved peoples working in cotton fields or picking crops or something like that. And it was kind of in an idyllic happy Southern life background. The notes themselves were pretty worthless. They weren't backed by gold or anything, so they had no monetary value. But there was a phrase on each currency note that said, "The Confederate States of America will pay," the number here, "to the bearer," basically after the conclusion of the war, after there's a peace treaty between the Confederates and the United States. But that never happened. But it's another record where African Americans are kind of represented. Next, go into some Abraham Lincoln records. This is from the personnel file of William Johnson. It's a note. This is Abraham's writing from 1861. William Johnson is often referred to as President Lincoln's valet, who is known for coming to D.C. with Lincoln from Illinois when he was elected president. This note kind of demonstrates their close association. It reads, "You remember kindly asking me some time ago whether I really desired you to find a place for William Johnson, a colored boy who came from Illinois with me. If you can find him to the place, I shall really be obliged." So this is writing to the Secretary of Treasury, and he's basically giving him a referral because William Johnson, I guess, had a position kind of in the White House, but it wasn't official. From this letter, William Johnson he secured employment with the Department of Treasury as a laborer and received an annual salary of $600 a year. In the personnel file of William Johnson, there's also kind of an early researcher request from 1939, which I find pretty interesting, of John E. Washington, who asks for a personal file of this William Johnson and also Solomon Johnson, who I'll talk about later, to early research inquiry into Black history records, which I find kind of neat that it's way back even in the 1930s. People were trying to find out more about this subject. William Johnson died in 1864, shortly before the end of the Civil War. And this little screenshot here, their close association is made famous in Hollywood now by the movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, where William Johnson is his sidekick in busting vampire heads and stuff. It was kind of an entertaining movie. Really. Next is more of Lincoln's scribble. It's really bad to read. This is from the personnel folder of Solomon Johnson, who was another African-American early federal worker for the Treasury Department. He came about in 1864 and had already known Salmon Chase. But again, Lincoln writes another referral, and this note is actually on a little kind of business card, front and back. But Lincoln scrawled away, and it was pretty effective. It says, "This boy says he knows Secretary Chase and would like to have the position made vacant by William Johnson's death. I believe he is a good boy, and I should be glad for him to have the place if it is still vacant. Signed, A. Lincoln." So in this letter is another letter of referral, and from the President of the United States. How much better of a vouch can you get? So Solomon Johnson also received a position in the Treasury Department as laborer, and he actually went on to have a pretty, I would consider, good career, over at least 17 years of federal service. So this is another document in the Solomon Johnson file, which is his oath of office. Federal workers, we all sign off on a little oath our first day in the government. His oaths, or any oaths from back then in the 1800s, are a little bit more elegant. They have a neat little stamp on them. We just kind of have a little computer printout now. It doesn't provide as much gravitas as this nice old piece of paper. But as I said, Solomon Johnson's first position was a laborer, and he also received $600 in federal salary. There are also 3 other oaths of office that are contained in his personnel file. Next, I have a letter that is written by Solomon Johnson to the Secretary of Treasury in 1881. And this was fairly late in his career. After 17 years of service, he takes it upon himself and uses exhibiting great agency in this letter, and gives a full account of his career with the Treasury, from his recommendation from Chase and Lincoln onwards. He also notes that he became the first African American to be appointed to a clerkship in the U.S. government. So at this time of the writing, his official position was clerk in the 3rd Auditor's Office. Some quotes from the letter are, "During this time of service, I have been able to give myself a fair knowledge of law, which I read at Howard University, and I have endeavored to improve myself in such liberal culture as becomes a good citizen. Basically, I'm a positive and productive member of American society." Then he says, "In view of my long and faithful service, I trust that I may receive such recognition as in your judgment you may find proper to give me, and that my unfortunate race relations may not be a bar to such recognition." So here he's pointing in a little line, just because I am Black American, give me a fair shot and give me the same recognition that other employees are getting as well. His personnel file is full of other letters of recommendation and letters of praise for his work. He has gotten promoted several times throughout his 17-year career. And this letter is kind of a neat find that it's showing in the 1880s, during the Reconstruction period, an African-American male who has a career in the government, and he's kind of putting his foot down nicely and lightly, but kind of assertively, and saying, I am worth as much as my other coworkers, and I would appreciate some recognition, little Christmas bonus check or something. So it's not just a humble brag to his boss. It is kind of just a letter, and it now survives in our personnel files. But it's a neat letter that I wanted to point out. Next is a letter from William Syphax to the President of the United States. This was written in 1865. William Syphax, the Syphax family is a kind of famous African-American family in the D.C. area. They were first slaves on Washington's Mount Vernon, and then became property of George Washington Parke Custis, who was related through Martha Washington's side, and eventually lived in Arlington. The property they lived on became Arlington Cemetery. So in 1865, he's relating the story in this letter of how his family came to live in Arlington Cemetery and how they would like to continue living there. After the Civil War, Arlington Cemetery was General Lee's house, and so it was confiscated by the government. But there were 10 to 17 acres of land that had already were always lived on by the Syphax family. So once the government bought all the property, they were kind of left like, are we supposed to move, or they were asking for the opportunity to buy back their portion of land. So he is writing to the president, voicing this concern. The president eventually referred the matter to the attorney general, and ultimately resulted in the bill for the relief of Maria Syphax, who is William's mother, which was signed by Andrew Johnson. And Maria and her heirs were titled the 17-acre plot of land. This bill for relief was passed in 1866. So William Syphax, there used to be a Syphax school in Washington, D.C., and it was named so because he was an early proponent of school desegregation and was the first president of the Board of Trustees of Colored Schools in D.C. Next is the 13th Amendment. It's kind of the most obvious choice for any records relating to African American history in any of the vaults. But I also, after I was done putting this presentation together, I was like, the Emancipation Proclamation's not in here. So that's a big one too. But I have the 13th Amendment. This was the first of the Reconstruction Amendments. That 13th abolished slavery and was passed in 1865. The 14th Amendment made former slaves citizens, which ended up kind of invalidating the whole Dred Scott case decision. And the 15th Amendment gave all citizens the right to vote. And then, in a nutshell, that's the Reconstruction Amendments. This is kind of one iteration of the 13th Amendment. And this one is signed by the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, Vice President Hannibal Hamlin as the President of the Senate, and then the executive branch representative is President Abraham Lincoln. So it's a nice, succinct version of the 13th Amendment. There's also proposals and edits to the amendments, drafts, and the other amendments itself, and other ratifying documents. So it's a whole big folder, but this is the one I picked. Next is a letter from the Communications from Foreign Heads of State in the Department of State records. This is a letter from the citizens of Monrovia in Liberia, and they were writing the Consul General of the United States in 1865 to forward some resolutions that they had recently passed. Liberia, of course, was founded by freed slaves from the United States. It started to be settled in 1821 and the land was, of course, also occupied by the Africans that already lived in that space. And then the Liberian government was established in 1847. So in 1865, President Lincoln is reelected to a second term. This is written in February. And it's the Civil War is ending, so they also were expressing, it's a quote, "Our feelings of admiration and gratitude to His Excellency Abraham Lincoln, President, for the measures he has inaugurated in the United States of America for the liberations of millions of our race who were held in that land in apparent hopeless bondage." So they're thanking him for freeing the slaves, which is Abraham Lincoln's basic tagline, he freed the slaves. And it's kind of a neat thing to see. You have this foreign country, it's kind of an established black country, and they're able to write back to the president, and it's kind of looking back and like they had left so many people behind because not everybody could go or free themselves or make the trip across the ocean. And they're able to just express like, we're happy this finally happened. It's basically in a lot of things that they were able to see the day come, and it actually did happen, that slaves were freed, and the great joy it felt. The foreign heads of state letters also contain letters from other places like Haiti and other continental African countries. So there should be other records in there similar to this if we captured any at that time. So after Civil War stuff, going into modern records, these are two famous other letters from the vault. One is of Richard Nixon's resignation as president. It's only 2 lines. That's all he had to say. And the other letter is a letter written by Fidel Castro when he was 12 years old, and he wrote to President Franklin Roosevelt asking for a $10 bill. He never received it. Sad. He gave him information all about the great iron that's in Cuba, too, but he didn't get a $10 bill. It's sad. So our first modern record is a decision from the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court case from 1955. This, of course, en masse desegregated schools in the United States. The picture is of Linda Brown, who's kind of the namesake of the case. But in actuality, there are 20 other children represented as part of the Board of Education Topeka, Kansas suit, and the whole Supreme Court trial and litigation was made up of 5 different places that were bringing cases to desegregate schools. They were from South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Virginia, Delaware, and Kansas. So a lot of things were wrapped up, but we always think of little Linda Brown when we think of this landmark case. So she had other allies, and her parents had other people around them, too. Thurgood Marshall, of course, was the lead attorney representing the NAACP. And, yeah, this is from the appellate jurisdiction case files, which are located in archives in Washington, D.C. downtown. And this is just one sheet from the whole file and it's just the judgment in the Supreme Court decision. There's also transcripts and other opinions written by the other justices as well. Next is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is signed by Lyndon Johnson, approved July 2nd, 1964. This is part of the Enrolled Acts and Resolutions of Congress from Record Group 11. We usually refer to these as the public laws. This act banned discrimination of public accommodations and allowed the Justice Department to initiate cases of civil rights violations on behalf of individuals. So in the rolling times of the civil rights movement in the really active 60s, there was this act, and there was also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave protections to citizens to freely go to polls to register and vote without hindrance of being harassed or having to take literacy tests or pay poll taxes. There's actually the 25th Amendment, I think, is the poll tax amendment, which abolished poll taxes. And this is also in the news and in the Oscars and the Academy Awards now. The movie Selma, that march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery was so that this could happen. Martin Luther King and SNCC were trying to bring attention to the great injustices in the southern states it's just they weren't allowing people, African Americans, to vote or get to the polls or anything at all. There were many instances where they were able to do that, but in large, it was a really oppressive state. And go watch Selma. It's a good movie. Next, go back a little time. One of my kind of geeked out moments when I started working in the vault, and I found that we have comic books. These are from 1944 and 45, and they're actually a learning tool that was used during World War II. The kind of rate of illiteracy in the United States became a glaring eyesore because there were military entrance exams, and depending on your score, if it was so low that you couldn't read or take simple commands, you were thought to be unfit, even though you had a strong body or something. So this started excluding many able-bodied men that were undereducated. And, of course, this disproportionately affected a really large amount of African-American men. So they're either excluded or put into really menial tasks during the war, such as the ditch diggers and things like that, when they could have been more active, higher-ranking soldiers, if not for their illiteracy. So to solve this problem, because if so many people were being excluded, they would actually have a shortage of soldiers, the military started making special training division programs, and they started offering short, 10-week courses where soldiers would be able to bring up their reading levels to about I think it was 3rd or 5th grade reading level, and what was considered acceptable. And then they also created lots of learning materials, such as this comic book, and there were other picture books that soldiers could carry along with them in the field to keep their reading up to task. DC Comics, who publishes Superman and Batman and other things like that, paired with the United States government during this time and created these special edition comic books. It's the front cover of Action Comics, and the back cover says this was prepared by the publisher with cooperation of the training activity of the Bureau of Naval Personnel for use as a supplementary reader and workbook in special training units. So another comic, I just wanted to show Batman. And you can see inside the comic books, after every little kind of short story, there's a test your reading knowledge section, which we're kind of all familiar with from elementary school in our little workbooks, but these were given to grown men and soldiers to help them bring up their literacy during the war. So there were kind of word searches, fill-in-the-blank sections, and reading comprehension sections that were all in these comic books. And I guess I'll end with kind of the most fun records I have in the vault are often the patent records. They show great innovation and kind of American ingenuity and spirit. And I've got probably 3 that are from African Americans. But there aren't only 3 African Americans that ever had patents. Sorry, that didn't sound right. I'm just featuring 3 particular ones. First is the folding beds patent by Sarah E. Good. This was issued in 1885. Sarah Good was the first African-American woman to be issued a patent. She was born into slavery in 1850 and moved to Chicago after the Civil War, where she ended up owning a furniture shop with her husband and also was an entrepreneur. Addressing the tight living quarters in Chicago that her customers lived in, she decided, hey, I will make a cabinet bed, which is kind of a precursor to the Murphy bed. So you can see on the first image, in the daytime, the bed stands as a regular working desk. And then at night, you can fold out the compartments, and you'll have a flat bed that you can lay on. And when I saw this patent, I was like, wow, it's IKEA. This could be great in the catalog. Especially when I had my first studio apartment. Like, space is tight, and it's kind of fascinating that she addressed that concern back in 1885. Now in Chicago, there's a Sarah E. Good STEM Academy. My friend's husband, Thurston, works there and told me about it. And they were discussing, like I saw a Facebook post about Sarah Good, and I was like, hey, I know that. And the curriculum is geared towards science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to prepare students for jobs that will be in really high demand in the near future. So her legacy kind of lives on, and hopefully now a lot of the students attending that school will know what she did and is known for. Next is George Washington Carver. He had a total of 3 patents that were issued to him, and none of them are for peanut butter, which is commonly thought that's what he did. George Washington Carver was born into slavery, but rose to become a prominent scientist and inventor, and he's mostly affiliated with the Tuskegee Institute. He developed methods that would help poor farmers in the rural South. He worked with soil chemistry, crop rotations, and he also made about 300 products from peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. These particular patents are for an improvement in cosmetics and process for producing the same, an improvement in paints and stains and a process for producing the same, and the process of producing paints and stains. So I wonder if he could have had a makeup line. I'm not sure what the patents are for. So the petition is for the cosmetics patent, and the oath is for the process in producing patents. And all patent files are kind of similar. They always have certain things in common. You saw the drawing parts from Sarah E. Good's patent, and then there's a petition saying I am applying for this patent, and an oath saying that I certify that this patent is my original creation, and no one else has thought of this yet. It's George Washington Carver. So next is, people ask, what's my favorite record in the vault? Here's a Michael Jackson patent. And this was done in 1993, I think. Its full title is The Method and Means for Creating Anti-Gravity Illusion. You can see from the drawings, it all involved a boot that Michael Jackson and dancers would wear when they were performing Smooth Criminal from 1988. And it kind of allowed them to do the leaning forward motion that amazed and wowed me as a kid. I probably have a lot of scars from falling into the coffee table trying to do it. And there's also pages with Michael Jackson's actual signature in the patent file. So this is my favorite patent. Can I open the link on there? How do I do that? Oh, it is work.
Should be able to.
Yeah, I have a link demonstrating. Will it go? I don't know. Do I have to exit?
While we're waiting for that to come open, if the audience would like to think about any questions they might have. I do not have any questions from our online audience at this time.
I have a question. Are you going to give this same talk again at Archives 2?
Yes? No.
No, I'm sorry. If you could repeat the question.
Oh, repeat the question. The question was, am I giving the same talk at Archives 2? Their answer is no. This will be put up on YouTube to be referred to later. So you can watch me as much as you want.
Is there a schedule that when these documents become available to the actual public, like is there a scheduled time that, or is there ever an opportunity to actually see, like for instance, the Michael Jackson patent in its real text?
There is no set schedule for when it's. I am kind of heading a large project to digitize everything in the vault because we don't allow researchers to see them in person, so that's how they're available. The Michael Jackson patent was just on display at Archives 1 in an exhibit for the signatures exhibit. So this is Michael. There's the lean. Yes. Okay. That was it. Oops. How do I go back? So yeah. Just to answer the rest of your question, I often receive research requests for people if something hasn't been digitized yet. I usually ask for 30 to 60 days for the labs to go through and digitize everything, and then they're made available to you for free. I can either send you a CD or, and then shortly after that, I put them up online in the online catalog. So it's just a matter of people asking for the things.
How did the shoes work to allow for the leaning forward?
On the sole of the shoe, there's another picture that I couldn't fit in here. In here, there's kind of a wedge, and there would be like a kind of a nail on stage, which they would lock in. So their feet just kind of were glued to the ground for that second. But it still took great upper body strength to control your body to do that. So it's amazing. Hi. Yes. Is there special environmental monitoring for the vault, like temperature and humidity? Yes, all the stack areas have controlled humidity levels. I'm always cold in there. I can't think of the specific humidity, but it's similar to museum settings. The general rule is the colder, the better for the records, the longer they last, and less deterioration will happen. So we keep it pretty cool in the vaults.
If I can follow up, speaking of cold, so what other, besides Michael Jackson, what other documents give you goosebumps?
Goosebumps. What other documents give me goosebumps in the vault? For another patent, I recently transferred to the A2 vault the patent for the Coke bottle, which is great. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation is pretty chilling to see, and it's another one of those records. It has to be in the vault. It is such an important piece of paper, and it is old, and it is kind of in a not so great shape, but to see it in person, it's only allowed exposure for about 40 hours each year, or 10 years each year. So if you have the opportunity to see it when they have it on display down in Washington, D.C., everybody should come out and see it. So it's a pretty powerful document to see. Yes.
When a request is made for records from your vault, where do you make the request? Online, by mail, what address?
The question was, where do you put in a researcher request, essentially? Mostly they are from people who are coming to the research rooms and find that this particular document has been pulled from the regular records that people can see. There's usually a little note in the description in the catalog. And so most of the researcher requests come through the research room. Like there's a form you can fill out in person down there. I also get online requests if somebody's looking online and they see the note that these records are specially protected. And there's an either Archives 1 or Archives 2 email that you can send in a request to. Yes?
What's the digitizing process? Like, how do you handle the documents, and then what are you using to scan it?
Well, most of that, I kind of just have control over the physical control. So, like, we have a huge system of record where the kind of inventory is taken of how many pages there are in a file and such like that. And then there's associated individual unique numbers assigned to each document. So I control that part. And then in the archives, we have a digital lab, which actually handles all the process down there. And they use scanners, cameras, and lots of other equipment that I know how to scan my family photos, but I don't know how to get to scan these documents to make them look their best. And that is the point. We do want to make them appear as real as possible, since this is the only time people are going to see them. So they're pretty high quality scans. We usually give 400 PPI images out, or higher if they're being published or something like that.
And all the images are public?
All the records are public. They aren't restricted at all. We haven't gotten to any yet, but there is kind of a Walt Disney drawing that might have some questionable copyright issues that we haven't dealt with yet. But otherwise, everything is public record because it's under the National Archives. So they're your records.
I actually have a question for you. But first, let me say thank you so much for your presentation today. Going back towards the beginning, you had the Confederate currency. And I was wondering, where would you find those records? I see it's record group 39.
There is another record group that solely consists of Confederate records, where lots of things have been collected there. I am blanking on the actual record group number right now. Like these are in record group 39, which are the records of somebody. I forget what they are. Records of the Bureau of Accounts. It kind of, your best bet would probably be to, if you're researching, look into agencies that existed during the Civil War. They will likely have records that were concurrent in time, and so they were confiscated after the end of the war. So Treasury obviously would have the Confederate money. Some Justice Department records might be from the Confederacy in the Justice Department. It's kind of, could be anywhere.
Thank you very much. We have a question that's come from online, those folks who are watching on YouTube. It's a very broad, open question about how we protect documents. The question is, how protected are documents during a disaster, such as war, natural events, and is there a hierarchy?
The vault gets rescued first. Well, there is a official agency plan for natural disasters that is the directive that would determine like the placement of our stacks that keep all our records, not just the vault records, but all the other records too. They are usually placed above ground to prevent flooding. The sprinkler systems within the stacks are efficiently placed so that they don't drown out the records and suppress fires if that should happen. Yeah, there's no real hierarchy of what do you say first if the building is burning down. During our fire drills, we are always advised to just, you save yourself, walk out of the building. We don't place, even though they are valuable and indispensable records, there is never a protocol to say, oh, go get the Constitution first. Although the Constitution is kind of in its own, it'll survive an apocalypse, the casing that it's in now. So that is pretty well protected. Yes?
Is there, when you're researching Black history or archival records, is there what is the most effective way on trying to get a better summation of all of the particular archival documents that may be pertaining to that particular topic?
So the question was how to research or find
Refining the search, because when you go on there sometimes it's it just gives you a couple of things, but then there's more under that, but it's only going to give you a couple.
Right. So yeah, where is a good finding aid for all the records relating to African American history in the archives? In 1984, There was a book published by Dr. Newman Ham called Black Records, Black History at the Archives. It's a pink book. And I'm actually co-heading the project now that is working to revise that book. And we are working to make it an online presence. So it basically can be what you're referring to, a central location to go and see where you can find any and all records relating to African American history in the National Archives. Since we have so many holdings and African American history is American history, strongly tied together, there are lots of records to put up and they're everywhere. So it's a really daunting task, but if you're aware of our blogs at the archives, we have the Rediscovering Black History blog, which is kind of updates we're giving along the way when we point out records like these in any upcoming presentations we're doing or something like that. So yeah, and something should be coming in the springtime for our first release of that project.
Is a security clearance required to go into the vault?
It's not required to go in, but as a vault manager, I do have one. I don't know if I was supposed to answer that. But, no. Yes. Yes, going into the vault, someone who is not a manager needs to be escorted by someone who is, and you only really ever go into the vault if you need to. Like, I can't just go into the vault on a Tuesday and be like, I want to see Michael again today. I need a reason to actually be handling the records and stuff like that, so, yeah. Hi.
What records in the vault are requested most often of, the African American history one?
I would say probably patent records are requested a lot, and also exhibits is pretty active requesters. We service them a lot, and they kind of focus on the records of the Department of State, which can have a lot of letters written by like our founding fathers, some records that kind of allude to slavery or other matters. There's some on international matters with Haiti or dealings with Algeria or something like that. So probably record group 59 and the ceremonial letters and stuff. That, I think. Right, Darlene?
Ms. Currie, thank you so much for your presentation today. We're looking forward to your future blogs and books. For those of you online, we welcome your comments. And for those of you on site, we have given you an evaluation form. You can leave that at the back table as you leave. Thank you so much for coming today.